And this is all God. It said, this is how you do it. Got it very laid out, very specific. And then on the 8th day, there's one bull, and so it totals 70. This was all. So that's what's going on throughout this festival. Is it's just a continual giving to God, a celebration of sacrifice to God, and every sacrifice is for the purpose of strengthening and renewing and showing appreciation to the one you love, like we did at Christmas just yesterday or the day before. You give gifts because of the people that you love, and so these are all sacrifices to God in every way possible to be able to just celebrate and rejoice on a God who lives among us. Excuse me. And so they are just celebrating over and over all of these sacrifices. And so that's a big part of this particular festival. The other big part of it was this thing about the booths, that people were instructed to set up this temporary housing, these booths, or actually literally is translated these tabernacles for the week. So you would live... you might have a nice house in somewhere, or, big, small, wood, or not, wood, but most of them were stone or mortar kind of houses. But on that particular week, you would go outside and you'd build basically like a tent. Like if you've ever been into your house and you say, oh, let's put a tent in the backyard. And they had specific instructions of how they would create this small booth out in the yard. And so they would use the 4 different species of trees, and so the willow, it goes in there and talks about them. The willow trees, citrus trees, every one of them, use all 4, and you build the walls of this booth. And it was important that when you built the roof, you had to be able to see through the roof to be able to see the heavens, to see stars. Because you can't obstruct your view for what the purpose is to look up unto God and be able to see the heavens and know, and to know that is the source of who you were here for and who it is you follow. And so they would create these booths in the yard, and then the instruction was to live in those booths for 7 days in the week. And in doing that, in this particular passage, it says it was a reminder. At the very end there, it talked about it was a reminder for when God delivered you out of Israel, your people, your descendants, that He had them live in booths. Well, really, what it was a reminder of, part of that was that their descendants spent 40 years in the wilderness out of disobedience to God. And so they were in this temporary housing because the plan of God was to take them out of slavery of Egypt and bring them to the promised land of where they were going to live and flow with milk and honey forever. But this was a reminder, this temporary housing was a reminder that their people were disobedient to God, and so it wasn't their home. This was temporary. This was not where they were meant to live. They were meant to live in the future at another place in the promised land. And yet they also were reminded through this was that, and even with that though, God was with them and God provided. God cared for their descendants. They never went out. If you read Scripture, it talks about their clothes never wore out, their sandals never wore out, they never went without food. God provided for their people. And so even in the disobedience of their ancestors, they knew that God cared for them and provided. And so they were reminded to be able to do this, that first of all their possessions, that this life was temporary. That all the houses and the materials they have, the wealth they had, that's not it. That their main home is with God forever. And so they would always think to that. In fact, they would quote 1 Chronicles 29, 14 through 16, which was David's prayer when they were going to build the temple, and all of Israel gave to God in the temple, similar to what all these sacrifices are given to God. And so that passage says this, "But who am I," David said, "and who are my people that we should be able to give as generous as this? Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. We are aliens and strangers in your sight, as were all of our forefathers. Our days on earth are like a shadow without hope. O Lord our God, as for all this abundance that we have provided for building you a temple for your holy name, it comes from your hand, and all of it belongs to you." That's what they're saying with this idea of this temple. Now, if you get into history, they didn't hang out. I mean, the rule was you had to at least have a meal in there once a day. They didn't really stay in it. And then they created other exceptions of why they couldn't stay in there. But the intent was to send a message and the reminder that, look, at all this stuff I have, this means nothing. My only home is with my Father in heaven. My only home will one day be with Him again in this, New Jerusalem, or that the restoration of what God would do. And that's what the booth was trying to be able to create for them. And God was creating this reminder that God is the one that their dwelling place, not the stuff that they had. Along with that, the booths, then, they had these 3 special ceremonies that took place. One of them was the waving. I mentioned to you these 4 species of trees, and they would bind them together, and so there's a citrus and a willow and a myrtle tree and a palm, I think, or something like that. They would get them together, and then they would go around together, and they would wave them back and forth and up and down, and it signified that, God's provision, first of all of the crop that they would have, but then also that God is everywhere, and God's presence was everywhere. And so again, in the dwellingness of God, it was acknowledging that God was always there. And so they would do that. And as they were doing that, they were chanting Psalm 118:25, which was, O Lord, save us. O Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They would be chanting that throughout the temple as they're going through this. Hosanna was the other expression of that. And they were doing that every day as a reminder of God is the one who's present. And He's the one who provides. God is the one who's going to be able to save us. And then adding to that, then, they had a water ceremony on the last day. And on that day, the priest would go back to the pool of Siloam, and he would, with a gold pitcher, he would gather some water, and they would all follow him back to the temple. And they called this the day of the great Hosanna, when they would do this on the 7th day. And again, they were singing the verse of Psalm 118, but also as he was pouring the water in the basin, they would also sing the words of Isaiah 12:2-3, which says, surely God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. Verse 3, with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. So they're thinking about the fact that this water is also what provides their crop for the next year. So they're talking about the next year coming and God's provision. But they're also talking about the provision of God in the salvation of His people. And Isaiah 44:3, for I will pour water on the thirsty land and streams of the dry ground. I will pour out my Spirit on your offspring and my blessing on your descendants. God was their provider. And through this festival and through this ceremony, they were acknowledging that was the source, was from God of this provision. The other major festival, so that was on the 7th day. On the night of the 7th day, they had a lighting of the temple. And all this is going to make sense in a little bit. Hang in there. A lighting of a temple. That was on the last day. And so what they would do is they would carry these torches, and they would go counterclockwise in the temple 7 times, similar to Jericho when God delivered Jericho to their people. And then they would march around. Again, they would chanting Hosanna and God save us and God provide. And then at the end, they would stick these lights at the wall of the temple all the way around, so bright so that they would say all the world would see. And then they would quote Isaiah 49:6. It says, it is too small a thing for you to be my servant to restore the tribes of Jacob. And this is God talking. And bring forth those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you, referring to Israel, the light for the Gentiles, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. So what Israel was believing was that in doing this, is they believed that their life had a purpose, that their life was meant to be a message to all of the nations of who God was, that God used them as a testimony to who God was. And they believed that because the prophet Zechariah had talked about one day, again in the future, when God restores and brings everybody together, it won't be just Israel. It'll be all the world that will come together once again to worship God. And so Zechariah 14:16-19, this is what they would quote. Then the survivors from all the nations that have attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, and to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles.